We continue to have a closer look at classes and objects. In this lecture, we are going to cover two new topics, the toString and the equals method. We will start with the toString method, and for the purpose of this lecture, we are going to use the old class, the rectangle class, the one that we are familiar with. So the motivation for the toString method is to think about what if you want to describe an object. So you create an object or instantiate an object from a class, and then at a certain point you would like to describe this object. So what you want to do is to try to use a bunch of system.out.println and try to print some kind of a message or a string that is useful and describes that object. So for example, if you think about the rectangle class, if you create an object out of this class and I ask you describe this rectangle, what you will do is that you will try to describe what is the length and the width of the rectangle. These are the two fields, and this is a useful message to tell me how or what this rectangle is, and basically it says what the length is and what the width is. So if you want to do this, you can think about it in this way. We could have our rectangle class, the class we are familiar with. So we have the width and length, we have the rectangle constructor, and then we have set width, set length, get, and get area. Then here I instantiated an object out of this class, which I refer to or point to as R. And this is a rectangle that has a length of 10 and a width of 2. So if I ask you to describe this object R, what you would do is that you would say system.out.println, and you could say something like this, width, or you could say, for example, objects are, all right, and then I could say length, right, plus length, or r.get length, and then I could say here space width and r.get width. Something like that. So if I compile, run, so it would print length and width. I could actually add, I could even add a new line here. So this makes it a little bit, looks nicer. So here for object R, we have that length, and this is the width. So that's a good message here that describes this object. Now the problem is, every time you create a rectangle object, you will have to print that statement. All right. What makes more sense is to put that statement or embed it into the rectangle class itself. So if you have a method that whenever you call it is going to print the information of a rectangle object, that would be very helpful and useful. So to do this, we're going to create what we call the toString method. Now, the reason why we use the word toString or the name toString method, it has a purpose. There is a reason why we do this. So we are going to discuss this in a couple of minutes. However, let's agree that we will have the toString method, and that's a method that is going to convert or to like, think about it this way. When you say an object toString, you are trying to say how would you describe this object as a string, which is basically a string that describes the properties of this object. So the toString method means as if you are saying from that object to a string, this is what you would get. And that's basically what we're doing here. It's a very simple string. It's a very simple method. All it does that takes no inputs. It returns a string. It has no print statements. And what it does that it creates a string which describes that object. And in our case here, it's very as simple as a width and length. And once you have this, all you do is that you just return that string. So here I could go and say something like this. System.out.println, and then another one here, which is going to be just as simple as r.toString. Here, compile, and let's run it. There we go. So it does the same thing. All right. So now for every single object you create, so if I go here and say something like this, here is a rectangle called R2 is equal to new rectangle, and I'm going to create this with 150. All right, and then I go and say copy and paste here, and then this time it's R2 dot toString. Right, compile, run, there we go. All right, and of course you can customize. So that's very simple and plain. It's not very informative maybe, but you could customize this. It's whatever you want to put in this string to describe your object. That's completely up to you. Now let's go back to the question that we had here. Why toString? Why do you call it toString, right? And what tells us that it's a method that does not print, and instead it returns a string. So I will show you something here that is very interesting. If you try to print R without calling the method toString, notice what's going to happen. It actually works. That tells you something very, very important. This toString method is not just a toString method that you can call or not. This toString method is actually part of every object that you create in Java. All right, so every class you create, whenever you instantiate an object out of it, that object that you instantiated has a toString method. All right, whether you define it or not, it's there. All right, so the toString method is something that comes with every single object in Java. Now, the question that we will have is, now, knowing that it comes with every object, what happens if I do not define it in that way? So let's now try to comment this one and still go and call that toString method. Would it work? All right, compile, run, there we go. It's actually running. All right, it's running and it returns something that doesn't really make much sense to us, but if you look at it, it will make some sense. So here, what happens is that we defined a rectangle class. We did not define a toString method. We instantiated an object out of it, and we tried to run or call the toString method for it. What happens is that Java, since it has to have that toString method, but at the same time it doesn't know how to describe that object for you, it's going to print something very standard here format, which is the name of the class from which that object was instantiated, and the memory hash, which tells you where this object is in the memory. All right, so that would apply to every single object you create. You create an object of an inventory item, and you do not define how to describe an inventory item, and you call its toString method, it's going to call it and say it's an inventory item object, and it's at that location in the memory. All right, so that is something to understand. toString method exists whether you define it or not. If you call it, it's going, without defining it, it's going to print something similar to this, which is not very informative for you, but it gives you some information about it. The other thing is that what you do is that you go and try to override it to make some sense, to print something that is actually useful as a string that people can read and understand. Now, the other thing that I mentioned and I didn't really focus on is that the fact that we can actually call it this way. All right, so here it would still work. All right, now the thing is that is toString method. For that specific method, you can explicitly call it by saying toString, all right, which is going to return that string to be printed here. Or you could call it as printing an object, and Java automatically will link that to calling toString implicitly. So whenever you go and tell Java, I would like to print an object, Java will understand that, okay, you want to print an object is a complex entity. So being or trying to print an object means you're trying to print the information about the object, which is the toString method. And in that case, it's going to call the toString method for you. So that is a very important point, and you need to understand that toString method, if you do not define it, it's there. If you do not explicitly call it and try to print an object, it's going to be called and used.